My mother said my sister should have married my husband, and now she's walking around my house in a towel. Growing up in a small, bustling town, I was always the shy, nerdy girl, lost in the shadow of my radiant, charming older sister, Fran. She was everything I wasn't: charismatic, confident, and the apple of everyone's eye. Fran had beauty, brains, and athletic prowess, and my parents, especially my mother, never missed an opportunity to remind me of the vast gulf between us. Now, at 29, I had managed to carve out a small piece of happiness for myself. I had a wonderful husband, James, a steady job, and a comfortable home. But recently, that fragile happiness had begun to crack under the weight of old rivalries and unresolved family tensions. And it all started with one offhand comment from my mother. Fran, my sister, had always been the star of our family. At 34, she still radiated the kind of effortless charm that had made her popular in high school. Back then, she was the girl everyone wanted to be friends with or date. James, my now husband, had been no exception. James and Fran had gone to high school together. They weren't just classmates, they were part of the same social circle, which often made me feel like the odd one out. I was 4 years younger and constantly excluded from their world. While they hung out at football games and house parties, I was stuck at home, reading books and dreaming of a day when I wouldn't feel invisible. James had confessed to me years later that he'd had a massive crush on Fran. Like most boys in their school, he'd admired her from afar, enchanted by her effortless beauty and confident demeanor. But Fran had been indifferent to his feelings. When he'd mustered the courage to ask her to prom, she turned him down in front of everyone, leaving him humiliated. They'd remained friends, though, and James had moved on, or so I'd thought. Fast forward to adulthood, and life had taken us in different directions. Fran married a wealthy man at 23, while James went out of state for college, and I just kept to myself. It wasn't until years later, when I moved to the city where James was living, that our paths crossed again. I had just graduated from college and moved for my first job. Lonely and unsure of myself, I reached out to James after my mother suggested I contact him. He was familiar, and even though we hadn't been close growing up, he welcomed me with open arms. We started hanging out, and over time, friendship blossomed into love. 3 years later, we were married. Fran, meanwhile, was living her dream, or so it seemed. Her husband, a successful entrepreneur, provided her with a life of luxury. But appearances can be deceiving. 2 years ago, Fran discovered her husband had been cheating on her with multiple women. Their divorce was messy, and despite the hefty alimony Fran had anticipated, a prenuptial agreement left her with far less than she'd hoped. She moved back to our hometown, broke and bitter, to live with our mother. When James and I moved back to our hometown during the pandemic to care for his ailing mother, Fran's situation brought us back into each other's orbit. She often came over to our house, seeking comfort and companionship. At first, I didn't mind. She was going through a tough time, and I wanted to support her. But her visits became more frequent and intrusive. She would show up unannounced, stay for dinner, and even sleep in our guest room. When I wasn't home, she would hang out with James, laughing over old inside jokes and watching movies they used to enjoy in high school. It started to bother me, but I kept my feelings to myself, not wanting to appear insecure or controlling. Then there were her habits. Fran would walk around the house in a towel after showering, or sleep in the guest room wearing nothing but a tank top and shorts. When I brought it up with her, she brushed it off, saying, "We're family. What's the big deal?" The real trouble began at a family gathering last week. We were sitting in my mother's living room, chatting over coffee, when Fran brought up her high school days. She joked about how James used to do her chores and help with her homework because he liked her so much. "He was so sweet back then," Fran said with a nostalgic smile. I felt bad for taking advantage of him. My mother laughed and said, "I wish you'd married James instead of your ex-husband. You'd be so much better off." Fran nodded, adding, "Yeah, maybe I wouldn't be living with Mom if I'd made better choices." I froze. The casual way they spoke about my husband, as if he were some missed opportunity for Fran, made my blood boil. "James is my husband," I said sharply, "and I don't appreciate you talking about him like that." My mother waved her hand dismissively. Oh, don't be so sensitive. It's just a hypothetical. I want both my daughters to be happy. Fran smirked but didn't say anything. I left the room, too angry to continue the conversation. That night, I told James what had happened. He tried to downplay it, saying it was just a joke and I shouldn't take it personally. But I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. It's not just about what she said, I told him. It's about the way she acts around you. She's too comfortable, too familiar. James sighed. Fran's going through a tough time. Maybe cut her some slack. I wanted to scream. Why did everyone expect me to be the understanding one? The next day, I came home from the gym to find Fran lounging on the couch in a towel, laughing at something James had said. That was the last straw. Fran, can I talk to you? I said, trying to keep my voice calmed. We went into the kitchen, and I let her have it. You can't just come over here whenever you want, walk around in a towel, and act like this is your house. It's disrespectful. Fran rolled her eyes. You're so uptight. Maybe if you weren't so insecure, you wouldn't feel threatened. Insecure? I snapped. You're the one who can't seem to respect boundaries. James walked in then, sensing the tension. What's going on? Your wife is overreacting as usual, Fran said, grabbing her purse. I'll leave you two to sort this out. That night, I broke down in front of James. I feel like I'm losing my place in my own home, I confessed. Do you even see how her behavior affects me? James took my hand. I understand why you feel this way. And I want you to know, Fran means nothing to me beyond being your sister. But if it bothers you, I'll talk to her. We decided to set some boundaries. Fran would have to call before coming over, and her overnight visits would be limited. James also agreed to be more mindful of how his interactions with Fran might appear to me. Fran didn't take the news well. She accused me of being controlling and trying to drive a wedge between her and James. But I stood firm. For the first time in my life, I put my feelings first. As the weeks passed, things began to improve. Fran's visits became less frequent, and when she did come over, she was more respectful. James and I grew closer. Our relationship strengthened by the honesty and trust we had rebuilt. Looking back, I realized that my insecurities weren't just about Fran's behavior. They were rooted in years of feeling overshadowed and overlooked. But now, I was finally learning to stand up for myself and to believe that I deserved happiness, too.